Morning. It's Gareth Wood again. Back with this week's story. This story is called Flat White, and by way of an introduction, I can say that if, like me, when you go to get a coffee, and people covered this subject probably way better than I have. If you go to get a coffee into a new coffee shop, and or they're called barista schools, or they're called chugging, steam filled bean emporiums. It's hard to just go get a coffee. I mean, you can go and get a coffee, but it's become harder to get a coffee. There are so many options, things, words I've never heard of before, words none of us have ever heard of, words they've made up on that very morning. If that kind of thing pisses you off, annoys you, then hopefully you'll dig this week's story, which is called Flat White. So here we go. Powell strolled confidently into the fray of work colleagues and announced loudly that Manton's has the best cappuccinos in the city. Ha 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 ha, they cackled and they hooted in suited unison, lifting the minuscule cups to their hyena maws and throwing back the coffee in one quick motion. Cappuccinos are played out, one of the younger executives bawled. They're for your grandparents, baby, something to rest on their colostomy bags. More laughter, a harsh and shrill cacophony, violent noise. We're on to espressos from Flick a Bean, Powell, you dick. We're getting it hot and fast. One quick shot and boom, we're flying, baby. Cappuccinos, one of them giggled inanely from the pinstripe chorus. You're a real piece of shit, Powell. Now Powell's lips trembled. He walked to the sink and he tipped his drink away. It had become excruciating and hard to keep up with the rigorous demands of coffee trends. Powell walked the streets and stared into the gilded windows of the numerous coffee shops and confusedly named barista schools. They all looked so intimidating now. Cups of all sizes seemed to be hurled through the yammer-laden air as steam pumped gaudy ghost ship galleons from pipes like train engines. Painfully exuberant staff pouted and preened and leaped and danced, their faces painted in new trends, their starved bodies dressed in new high street coolness. They seemed to use language that Powell could not quite grasp. It was the language he spoke, but somehow different, as if everybody else but him carried impediments in their mouths, and he had to wince and lean in to get their intonation. Coffee shops had become alien lands. They were now chambers of lunacy and oblique logic. But Powell needed to keep up. He needed to be part of it. He needed to be in the machine. He couldn't afford to fall away like a rusty cog. He couldn't afford to fall away. The other executives didn't want him to sail on their seas of coffee, but he would alight and join them against their will or otherwise. These espressos are lit, Powell mused as he walked into the office and hammered his shot of bitter coffee towards the back of his throat. Ha ha ha, they laughed at him again. Espressos are bullshit, Powell. One of the executives stepped forward and put his hands on his hips. They're purely for pussies, baby. He thrust his groin at Powell. If you want your meat to dance, you get yourself a red eye. A red eye, he questioned nervously. What's a red eye? Ooh-wee, one of the executives screamed maniacally, his face contorted into frenzy as he ran to Powell and pressed his face into his, right into his face. A red eye is the new hardcore, Powell. It's a souped-up espresso and it jacks your heart like a Caesar, you foolish old bastard. And he grabbed Powell's wilted espresso and he crushed it in his fist. Powell fell backwards against the sink. Where do you get them? Where do you get them? He pleaded. They all laughed again. Not at the greasy spoons you go to, Powell. These bastards are from Atomic Roast, down in the industrial zone, too cool for a latte sucker like you. They stormed past Powell, exhilarated by the red eyes, slapping his face and his thinning hair as they did so. One of them stuck her fingers in his mouth and made him gag. An Atomic Roast looked like a factory, and Powell sidled through plastic strips of slaughterhouse doorway and beheld the zigzags of speeding conveyor belts that hurried frothing cups to fevered hands at a blinding pace. A type of music Powell had never heard rattled his jaw, and men with complex beards and tattooed fingers regarded him with eminent disgust. Powell couldn't see a counter, a place to order, couldn't see tills, he couldn't see any of the normal, perfunctory items that you would notice in a coffee shop, a bar, or any kind of restaurant. An arachnid man in taut black leathers licked his lips with a mixture of seduction and loathing and swung towards Powell on a rope made of paisley neckties. You ready for jackhammer heartbeats, pasty? Powell just stared at him, unsure what to say. You got old carcass tin man, the beard was becoming impatient. Red eye, Powell said nervously, unsure what response this would elicit. Tired tremors for the old timer. The man called to an athletic colleague hung from a trapeze who swung down into the steam abyss and handed over a thimble of muddied brown. Down the cough colliery, the barista grinned. Wake the miners in your balls. Powell's shaking hand held the coffee into his mouth, and he felt his body stiffen momentarily before palpitation shook him out of the shop. These red eyes, he beamed as he walked into the office. I mean, my fucking heart is, ha ha ha. The executives were semi-clothed and hung from chairs and fittings like a swarm of defecating lunatics. This old turd is on last week's Java. One screamed and hurled a stapler at Powell's empty red eye, his proof of compliance. I thought this was what you all wanted, he hollered at him, his face disfigured by sadness. Ha ha ha. The nearby executive grabbed his jaw and stared at him with cracked, blood-splattered eyes. We're beyond you, Powell. We're better than you. We've gone beyond red eyes now. We're hot into green eyes. Green eyes, he choked. The quadruple triples, you pussy. The eye of the storm. Powell grabbed fearfully at the nearest surface that supported himself as the highfalutin hyenas cackled and danced around him. He wasn't sure if the palpitations were due to the coffee or the terror of his frenzied, caffeine-addled colleagues stalking him, their faces pinched by dreadfully disfiguring glee. They began chanting in strange and guttural voices, and Powell could not even determine what they were saying in the manic mantra. It was as if they were speaking in tongues. The garbled Christ phrases replaced by noises that appeared to echo those of the machines used to make their coffee drinks. One of them raised their hands into a funnel and began to make whooshing noises, as if impersonating a steam vent, whilst two of the others grabbed each other at their shoulders, locked up like wrestlers collar and elbow, and spun wildly as if demonstrating percolation. Another crouched and curled into a ball whilst the final executive pretended to slide into the orifice that existed between their groin and chest. It was as if they were being poured into their colleague. Powell's eyes widened with abject horror. They were becoming the coffee. Dazzled, sleepless, haunted, Powell staggered through the streets. His mouth hung lamely from an unshaven jaw. Powell was a man lost in the trends of coffee. He could not understand why such seemingly pointless variety had absorbed residents of the city so vehemently. It was as if they were desperate for anything new, regardless of whether they wanted it or not. If they heard about it, if a billboard advertised it, if a jingle sang about it, then they wanted it. Lifestyle magazines like Gilded Sty, Lamprey, and Sucking Pomp printed reams of words about coffee and how to consume it. They spoke in detail about the stylized poses purveyors of Beanie Java must adopt before pouring the drinks. Then they spoke in equal detail about what positions the customers should adopt when imbibing their purchases. There were recommendations of music to drink coffee by, and even clothing ranges and styles specific to which coffee a person was sipping. It was all too much for Powell. He knew that he couldn't keep up. So the only option was to get ahead of the game. None of the executives had seen old basic cappuccino Powell for several days, and those that had thought of him vaguely recalled his cowering beneath their wave of coffee coolness. His sobbing was like the refrain from a song it was not fully possible to summon to mind. That was how many of them saw Powell in any case. Old basic cappuccino latte Powell, a dated theme tune to a television show they saw in the backgrounds of their childhood living rooms. He was sepia, right? Old photographs, faded and curled in a sealed box. He was an old toenail resting between the gap in the floorboards of an empty house. And they were drinking their flat whites when Powell arrived in the break room. And they'd returned to a milkier and simpler coffee now, but one that retained some level of fashionable verve. Flat white. It was cool, right? The way it sounded. Flat white. Flat white. I'll have a flat white. 2 flat whites. One of them was in the process of saying this and discussing how espressos were played out when the door to the break room burst inward and Powell stumbled into the arena of the corporately judged. A face of rigour and woe, Powell's complexion was sub-jaundice, as if he had been the victim of brutal assault and the bruises had now paled to a dull and lifeless smudge. His face. Powell walked with an odd gait. One leg appeared to shoot ahead of the other, with the rest of his body following under duress. Powell's mouth opened in motorised regularity. A deep and worrying gurgling emerged from the back of his throat. The overcoat in which he was draped was long and heavy, unseasonable. It was almost like a cape, and Powell's arms were beneath it. He appeared to be clutching something as he walked towards them, and he burbled a stream of incoherent syllables and tried to force a grin as he arrived at their table. He was accompanied by a bitter smell of offal, coffee and feces. Wavering as he stood there, leaning in towards the executives and almost falling backwards. Powell tried to enunciate his thoughts. It seemed to agonise him, and his eyes swelled and rolled. Tears streamed from the vein rims. "Speak up, you old fruit," one of the executives barked dismissively, turning to the others and shrugging. "You're behind the curve again, Powell. We're on to flat whites now. Espressos are yesterday's trend." Ahead, Powell groaned, his voice like an underwater song. "Ahead," one of the others questioned. "Powell, you weren't even ahead of your afterbirth, baby." They all screeched and applauded, and Powell began to undo his coat from within. He repeated "ahead" with more confidence and vehemence. He was certain. "Ahead! I'm ahead! I'm ahead!" Whatever he was trying to express, he was certain of it. He groaned, with 2 trails of brown liquid beginning to pour from the sides of his grimace. "I am." "You're what?" they said. "What are you, Powell? What is it you're trying to tell us, Powell? Old cappuccino Powell, played out Powell. What are you trying to tell us, Powell?" I am the coffee." Powell's coat opened like a woolen wave and fell to the floor. The executives gasped and gagged in unison. Attached to his torso, a series of pipes and funnels intertwined with his flesh and exposed ribs. The centrepiece, bristling and bubbling away, was a carafe implanted into the protuberance of Powell's stomach. A jug. The liquid within was a mixture of dark coffee and thick, phlegmy wads of fat and bile. And Powell stared intensely at the carrying executives and their flat whites. Then his quaking hand reached towards a dimly lit skin-covered switch and he compressed it painfully. Powell began to shudder. He began to percolate. The carafe steamed and rattled. His face contorted into a yowl and rippling burn spread across his chest, exploding the weighty pustules that pocked his disfigurement. Powell managed one more scream of "I am the coffee!" before the liquid contained in the carafe began to spurt from his mouth in boiling wet spears. Powell used every ounce of physical control he still retained to ensure that the faces of every one of those fucking executives were scalded, soiled and sullied. As the carafe emptied and the victims of the coffee rolled around beneath him, pressing the peeling skin back to their skulls in the hope that it would remain there, Powell collapsed against the table and fell lifelessly to the floor. Just one more used vessel from the coffee shop at the end of the night. Okay. Hope you like that. Hope you can empathise with Powell's plight of coffee trends and the necessity of staying up to date with colleagues in vacuous and shitty neon workplaces. I'm sure that's something we all can empathise with if you care that much about what your colleagues think, which you shouldn't. However, everybody's been in that spot, so hope you dug the story. I've got a couple more from this week, a few more little bits, a couple of long novellas for those of you that are interested in how it's going with the new novel. I just came in under 50k the first edit, so probably about another 25-30k to go before I'd consider it submission / rejection / shredder / murder ready. So yeah, so that's where we are. Maybe 4 weeks time, hopefully no more than 6, and it should be ready to hassle agents and publishers with. However, in the meantime, more stories to come as always, more new work, and until the next time, take care, enjoy your weekend, look after yourselves, and cheers for watching. All the best.